There have been a number of occasions that we have invited members of the public, members of the press, to join us for a discussion about various actions and investigations that have been undertaken by this agency that have one thing in common, and that is the protection of the most vulnerable members of our community, New Mexico's children. A little more than a year ago, we announced the investigation into the New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department as a result of, frankly, one of far too many tragedies that have originated in that agency over the last several years. And it was the suicide of a 16-year-old boy, Jaden Garcia, who took his own life after numerous turns inside CYFD and his placement in congregate care. And it was, I think, a wake-up call not only for the investigators and lawyers in this agency, myself included, but other members of the public who have become increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress and the lack of accountability, quite frankly, inside the department that is primarily charged with safeguarding the interests of abused and neglected children in New Mexico. And so we have called you here today to discuss and summarize the findings that are contained in what I believe to be the most comprehensive overview of that agency, perhaps in its history. It's a 214-page report that was conducted over the last year into not only the facts and circumstances surrounding Jaden Garcia's death, but the institutional issues and systemic failures that led to his tragic case, but also to the substantial number of New Mexico's children who have been harmed, who are abused and neglected, who have been left in homes that are unsafe. A system that is, I think, defined not only by institutional failure, but more importantly by moral failure. A failure on the part of the leadership and the public administrators in that building and in that agency who have been incapable and unable to right the ship and create a system that truly protects the most vulnerable. And so it is going to be difficult for us to summarize a 215-page report in a short period of time, but I will do what I can to highlight the key findings. But before I move on, I want to encourage every member of the media and every member of the public to visit the digital version of this report. And the reason that is so important is that this is a static document. The digital report actually includes video, lapel video, audio recordings, dynamic evidence that was reviewed by our agents and our investigators, and you can see for yourself the interaction that law enforcement has with individuals who are found at the scene of abuse and neglect, crime scenes, at homicide scenes. You will hear directly from people who work inside the system. You will be able to see detailed testimony from NICU doctors, caregivers, investigators, virtually anyone who touches the child welfare system in this state. Over the course of this investigation, our agents and attorneys reviewed over 20,000 pages of records, interviewed more than 150 witnesses, including law enforcement, child abuse prosecutors, foster parents, guardians ad litem, and CYFD. And as a consequence of that investigation, they identified and have set forth in detail 8 systemic failures inside of the agency. Failures of leadership and broken workforce, gaps in protecting drug-exposed infants, devaluation of foster parents, unsafe and traumatic office stays, missed removals and premature reunifications, undermining law enforcement, which is a theme that occurred throughout the investigation, excessive placements and warehousing of youth in congregate care. If you distill each of the elements of those core findings, it's our perspective that there are two fundamental issues that are driving the problems inside CYFD. Number one is, and this really goes into what the law in New Mexico requires and what CYFD has been doing. So to point out, I think a key feature of all of those systemic failures is state law is clear, is that when family preservation conflicts with the child's health and safety, the child's interests must come first, the interest in safety. Rather than prioritizing child safety, however, CYFD has a cultural orientation that prioritizes reunification at the expense of safety. And when you peel away each of those systemic failures, it is that core cultural orientation which drives most of the most tragic outcomes that we see inside the system. As a secondary problem, but equally important, especially for members of the news media who I know have encountered this problem themselves, CYFD is required under the terms of the Children's Code and the confidentiality of the Children's Code to safeguard the personal identifiers of children in the system while releasing non-protected information, ensuring transparency rather than using confidentiality as a barrier. What that means is that the confidentiality provisions of the Children's Code are meant to protect children. They are not intended to be a shield for government accountability, but that is what has happened. Specifically, confidentiality provisions have been weaponized by that agency as a form of intimidation and retaliation, not only against their own employees, but others who have information about the failures of the foster care system, of the investigation system. And most acutely, we see it in foster parents and others who raise concerns and then suffer retribution and suffer retaliation for raising those concerns. And that is the focus of the lawsuit that we will be detailing at the end of this news conference. At a very high level, our systemic failures in each of those broad categories lead to absolutely horrendous outcomes. One of the most important is the rate at which New Mexico has repeat maltreatment at a rate that is far beyond the national averages, but also surrounding states. And you can see here how we compare both regionally and nationally when it comes to repeat maltreatment. In terms of trying to understand what that means, this is the number of times a child is abused again after already going into the system. And it's a clear, and I think probably the most important measurement of the impact and efficacy of the agency itself. What it means in real terms is that if we only matched the national average when it comes to repeat maltreatment, we would actually have 360 fewer cases per year, 360 cases in children per year that would not be impacted or abused again if only we matched the national average. 40% of the investigations that we reviewed in the course of our investigation failed to meet the 45-day policy deadline. We have 2 times the number of placement moves above the national average, and it takes on average 11 months for an adoption to be finalized. But most importantly, in the last 2 years, 14 children have lost their lives in the state of New Mexico who should have been protected by this state. And if we had an effective system, they would still be with us today. We're number 1 in the country in child fatality rate amongst Western states. Those are the top line sort of statistics. And I think for members of the media, members of the public who have been following along with the LFC reporting on these topics, on the advocates reporting on these topics, I think we do a disservice if we stop just with statistics. We need to always recognize and have a clear perspective that underneath all of those systemic failures are children who are unnecessarily placed in harm's way. And I would like to, at this time, go over 3 of the case studies that are included in our report. These are not the only case studies, but I think they are relevant to your consideration about how well functioning or ineffective this agency currently is. So the first is Elena. It's a 16-year-old blind, nonverbal young woman, girl who was in a home that frankly was completely filthy, completely unsuitable, and she was, as this overview details, she was investigated 7 times. There were 7 different referrals to CYFD over the course of her time in that home, and she was entirely dependent on her mother for her survival because of her physical limitations and disabilities. The 7 investigations occurred over 5 years, documenting hazardous living conditions, missed medical appointments, and escalating neglect. And every single one of those investigations were closed without substantiating any cause for a formal action. Ultimately, Elena was found dead. She was emaciated with pressure sores, insect bites, and maggots on her body. And her mother admitted at the time that she hadn't fed, changed, or cared for Elena in over a week. The cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration from prolonged neglect. That, in and of itself, is a stain on the state of New Mexico and a stain on our collective sense of purpose, I think, as a community. What is truly shocking in this case, and sadly it isn't the only case, is that after the mother was charged with a criminal case for the actions that led to Elena's death, CYFD personnel appeared in a criminal proceeding and testified on behalf of the mother that she was a suitable candidate for reunification with her surviving children. That is unconscionable. That is inexcusable. And unfortunately, that is not the only example of reunification taking priority over safety. Another example is Lucas. Lucas was 8 months old. He was the latest addition to a small family, or a family here in New Mexico, whose mother was clearly suffering from a drug abuse and substance abuse addiction for a number of years. That household and that parent had been investigated by this department 23 times since 2005. Lucas was found at the time of his death wedged between a mattress and the wall in a filthy drug-filled home. 3 of his 5 siblings tested positive for methamphetamine. CYFD received its first report on Lucas's mother again in 2005. 4 of her 6 children were born drug abused and drug exposed. CYFD knew that she had never completed drug treatment and continued to allow her to retain custody. And again, after Lucas died, pending a criminal investigation into his death, CYFD still initiated a trial home visit for the potential return of his siblings to his mother's care. During the time that trial visit was recommended, she continued to test positive for methamphetamine. This is inexcusable, and it's another example of what is going on in these homes, more importantly, in these agencies, and with investigators who simply have the wrong orientation, lack of supervision, lack of resources. But, you know, even in this instance, after the trial home visit began, the 3-year-old sibling told his therapist, "Mama slapped me." CYFD observed red marks on the child's face and still didn't terminate the at-home trial visit. Last but not least, Isabella, the baby girl, is 1 year old. She was born drug exposed. She was thriving in foster care. She was extremely premature and spent 5 months in the NICU. She was thriving in her foster parents' care, and despite the parents' explicit warning, the foster parents' explicit warning, and her father's 21 arrest criminal record, including felony child abuse, CYFD endorsed a trial home visit, and Isabella, as a consequence, died of blood head force trauma 42 days later. Her mother was charged with her killing, and Isabella's 7-year-old brother told forensic interviewers, "I think my mom killed Isabella," and described her being slammed against the wall. There is, as shocking as these 3 examples are, there are even more examples detailed in this report. And I again ask members of the media to very carefully look at all of the documentation, all of the records that are included in those, because every single one of these children deserves to have their story told. Every single one of these children deserves to be recognized. And every one of us in public office, in a leadership position, should understand and be familiar with the details of these kids and what they went through before they lost their lives. We detail, of course, in this report, a path forward. These are things that will not be, I think, new to those of you who have been tracking oversight from the legislature, oversight from outside advocates, the Kevin S. Agreement, and the co-neutrals. All of these recommendations have been included in before, but I think they are directly tied to the investigative findings that we issue in this report. These are the 5 key areas that we think next leaders of this agency and the new administration in January would focus on. Building a skilled workforce, strengthening investigations, fixing safety and permanency, protecting at-risk infants, and demanding accountability. One of the things that we have not done in this investigation is to specify specific legislative or policy steps to achieve these particular goals. But we intend to work carefully with policymakers in Santa Fe should they have additional follow-up and questions about what they think needs to be done to achieve these outcomes. I will say, from my own perspective, one of the things that needs to be carefully considered is the extent to which investigations and placement are contained within the same unit. Within CYFD. And the reason for that, it naturally creates a tension if an investigator wants to remove a child because they're focused on safety and another corner of the building is struggling to find capacity. Oftentimes the lack of capacity is what informs a judgment about whether or not to remove that child. And that's the wrong kind of orientation that creates a structural conflict, where if someone is thinking, they should only be thinking, is this child going to be safe tonight in this house? That's it. But if someone on the other side of the building says, well, we don't have a bed or we don't have capacity, there seems to be a tendency that rather than filing a petition or removing a child from a home, to put them under a safety plan, which is where most of these tragic outcomes occur. Which is not to in any way diminish the need for capacity, the need for more foster care families, temporary placements, and the establishment of new resources for these kiddos. But frontline investigators should only be making determinations on child safety, period. And that seems to be one of the structural issues that I think needs to flow from the findings of this investigation. Last, we are announcing today not only the findings of this report, but the filing of a lawsuit initiated by the New Mexico Department of Justice against the Children, Youth, and Families Department, seeking to do one specific thing which we believe is critical for further oversight and accountability, and that is to ask a judge filed in Santa Fe in district court there in the First Judicial District to narrowly construe the confidentiality provisions of the Children's Code only to protect the privacy interests of kids. The reason that is so important is that this has been a recurring theme, that people who speak out, people that speak up, people that raise their hand, they, rather than being thanked for coming forward, rather than being used as a resource for identifying potential problems in the system, they are punished. And that has to stop. We cannot live in a world where people who speak out about government misconduct, especially when it leads to the death of children, to be punished in any way. More importantly, it isn't the law in New Mexico. That department has been misapplying, misinterpreting, and abusing confidentiality as a way to shield adults in positions of power and as a weapon of retaliation, and that is going to come to an end. I will give you just one small overview of some of the practices that we are talking about, but I know some of you here have covered a tragic event that occurred in Silver City. There was a 5-year-old boy who died after CYFD had failed to investigate a number of abuse reports. And the surviving sibling was placed with his maternal grandmother, who was, by all accounts, providing exemplary care. She was going through the process of trying to get her provisional licensing, and she was also trying to cooperate with law enforcement. And as a result of her willingness to share information with law enforcement, she was called into a CYFD office in Silver City, believing that she was there to get new information and an update on how she could secure her status as the guardian for that child. But rather than being given that assurance, what CYFD did instead was to summon her to the office under the pretense of foster licensing appointment and immediately removing that child from her care because she had spoken out, because she had raised her hand, because she had said that what was happening with CYFD shouldn't have been happening. And the child was placed with a non-relative, and the grandmother was blocked from seeing that child. That is a violation of the law. It is a violation of the morals and standards of this community, and it is a central component of what the lawsuit that we filed today seeks to put an end to. No one who has information about the failure of a government agency that is endangering children should ever be punished for coming forward. No one. And that is something that is going to be an objective of this office. Regardless of what happens, we can only fix this agency if we know what's going on. All of you as members of the media, all of you as members of the public can only demand change if you know what is happening. And if we silence critics, if we allow people in positions of power to abuse that power, you will never know the stories of these children. And I can say and can speak from our own personal experience, this agency was denied complete access to records at CYFD. This agency, as detailed in this report, repeatedly sought direct access to case files, to case information, to documentation held by that agency, and we were denied as the chief law enforcement officer of this state. So imagine what it is for an advocate or a nonprofit group or a member of the media to try to get access to this information. We need sunshine, we need transparency, we need accountability, and that is something that we are committed to for as long as it takes. I know we've covered a lot of ground, but I think it's important for you to hear from members of our community who can speak directly to the tragedy that flows from the lack of accountability inside this agency. And I want to invite and thank Carla Garcia for being with us today. It was, after all, the death of her nephew Jaden that prompted this investigation. We're going to hear also from Chief Deputy David Funes from the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, and from Matt Beck, an attorney who is very familiar with the practices of this agency with respect to violations of confidentiality. And then with that, we'll open it up for any of your questions. But with that, I'll turn it over to Carla.
Thank you. First off, I would like to thank the New Mexico Department of Justice for providing us with the opportunity to make a statement on behalf of Jaden Garcia. Jaden and his siblings were taken into custody June 2023. Jaden was a 16-year-old boy who was funny, artistic, and had a deep love for his siblings. His younger siblings looked up to Jaden, and although there was quite an age gap between them, Jaden always made time to play basketball with them, play video games, or make paper swords out of paper mache, as he was very creative. Jaden was a source of comfort for his siblings during a time of much uncertainty for them. Jaden was a sweet kid, but Jaden had struggles related to the instability of the life he had been exposed to for the past several years. In the time that Jaden was in state custody, he was shuffled between sleeping in CYFD offices to AMI Kids, which was where he ultimately took his life on April 12, 2025. Since the time that Jaden went into custody, our family advocated to CYFD about our concerns related to Jaden and his mental health. To date, we have no knowledge on whether CYFD took these concerns seriously, as we received no response nor a simple acknowledgement that our concerns were being addressed. In February of 2024, I personally wrote a letter to our governor's office expressing my concerns related to the multiple CYFD failures and the lack of support we were experiencing. In the closing statement of that letter, I acknowledged that although we were hundreds of families going through the same experience, we would not allow CYFD shortcomings to be our nephew's story. We would not allow them to be some news article of how CYFD was failing children in custody yet once again. 1 year later, that exact statement became our reality. CYFD failed to address any of the concerns we had voiced. Jaden was placed in congregate care at AMI Kids, a facility in which he had run away from multiple times, and a facility that was not the best environment for kids that had similar struggles to Jaden. Had CYFD provided the appropriate support and resources that Jaden so desperately needed, I have no doubt my family and I would not be here today. I appreciate the New Mexico Department of Justice for their commitment to change and reform within CYFD. I hope to one day see CYFD adhere to their promise of protecting kids in their custody, and that Jaden's death is not in vain and is the catalyst for much needed change. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As a chief deputy, I hear directly from our deputies, detectives, supervisors, special victims unit personnel, and our behavioral health unit. What I continue to hear is a constant concern. Too often, our personnel respond to serious situations involving children and families in crisis, and they leave frustrated because the level of intervention does not match the level of danger. Our deputies are the ones showing up to these homes. Our detectives are the ones investigating abuse, neglect, and violence. Our supervisors are the ones helping make difficult decisions in real time. And our behavioral health unit is the one working to connect families to services, treatment, and support. We are doing our part. But too often, our people feel like they are stepping into situations where the system that is supposed to protect children is not responding with the urgency, consistency, or coordination that these cases require. One of the biggest concerns I hear is this: when our deputies or detectives identify serious safety issues involving children, they are sometimes met with resistance to stronger protective action. Our personnel see the conditions firsthand. They assess the risk, they document what is happening, and then they leave and then they are left frustrated when children remain in or are returned to unsafe environments before the danger has truly been addressed. I also hear repeated concerns about temporary measures being used in situations that clearly require something more durable and decisive. When those efforts fall short, law enforcement is usually the one called back, again and again, to the same home, to the same family, often to an even worse situation. I also want to speak to the impact this has on the investigations. When children remain in the custody or control of adults tied to abuse, neglect, or instability, that can affect whether a child feels safe enough to speak openly. It can interfere with the truth, it can delay accountability, and most importantly, it can delay protection. I also hear concerns about communication. Our deputies and detectives need timely responses. They need clear decisions. They need consistency. When children's safety is on the line, there cannot be confusion, delays, or gaps in coordination. And I want to speak specifically about one family our personnel dealt with. This was not a single incident. This was not a one-time crisis. This was a prolonged pattern of repeated law enforcement responses involving domestic violence, unsafe living conditions, lack of supervision, runaway behavior, and significant behavioral health concerns involving the children. Over time, the danger escalated to the point that young children accessed a firearm and threatened responding deputies. This is the kind of moment that makes clear we are no longer dealing with isolated warning signs. We are dealing with a family in deep crisis. And even then, our personnel did not just respond to emergencies. Our deputies, detectives, supervisors, and BHU personnel continued stepping in to try to help stabilize that family and connect them with services and support. But this case also shows how law enforcement can end up repeatedly managing the consequences when earlier intervention and stronger protective action do not occur. This is not how the system is supposed to work. From my perspective, the concern is simple. Our personnel should not have to keep returning to the same dangerous situations because meaningful action was delayed again and again. We need genuine coordination. We need timely intervention. And we need decisions that prioritize the immediate and long-term safety of children. Our deputies, detectives, supervisors, SVU personnel, and BHU staff will continue doing their jobs. They will continue showing up. They will continue protecting children and families. And they will continue working to connect people to help. But they should not have to carry this burden alone. Children in crisis deserve a system that responds early, works together, and acts decisively before that harm gets worse. Thank you.
I'm honored to be here today. Not because I'm here, because we're all here. This is something that has been an issue in our state for far too long. And thank you, Attorney General, for taking the courage to put a stop to it. My general practice is in some different areas of litigation, including First Amendment civil rights work. And that's how I got into this. I knew someone who was a great foster parent who took an issue of CYFD not providing the right services to her foster child to the Attorney General. And for doing that, she lost her foster license. And I didn't do anything. And then there was a foster parent down in Hobbs who was sued by CYFD because when her foster children were returned in a trial visit, the parents absconded with them. She tried to get CYFD to issue an Amber Alert. CYFD refused, even after a judge ordered it. So she went to the public and raised concerns. And for that, CYFD sued her, saying that she violated the confidentiality statute. Now, as you've seen, these have real consequences. In that case, the consequence was that an infant turned up in a hospital in North Carolina with severe brain damage. I also know about this Silver City case, not because of the tragic death of the young woman, but because the grandmother reached out to me when CYFD took away her grandson out of her foster care. These are just a few anecdotes, the tip of the iceberg. It's what's publicly available, because if it's not publicly available, CYFD takes the position that even I can't tell you about it. These are just examples. I get so many calls from foster parents, CYFD employees telling me about the retaliation they face for raising issues, asking me if they should seek the payments they're entitled to for the foster children in their home, asking if they should seek the Social Security benefits that their adopted children or foster children are entitled to under the law and under proclamation from the executive. And unfortunately, oftentimes, my answer is not yes, because those parents are so concerned about losing their children if they ask that CYFD provide to their children what the law entitles them to. And I give them my experience. And unfortunately, it results in damage to these children. And so again, I'll finish where I started, which is thank you, Attorney General, for having me here. Thank you for the entire New Mexico Department of Justice for what you're doing. And I'm heartened to see the beginning of change for this state that will benefit all of our children.
So before we open it up to questions, I want to reflect on a couple of things that were mentioned. You heard from the Chief Deputy about the impact on law enforcement and the impact that this system is having, not only on the kids that are being harmed in our community, but in seeking justice in the criminal space and in the criminal justice system itself. As a former child abuse prosecutor, I can tell you that there is a profound misalignment right now between the criminal justice system and CYFD. When you have police and prosecutors actively prosecuting people for child abuse resulting in death, and have this at the same time people who work for the state of New Mexico seeking to reunify that criminal suspect with their surviving children, it is demoralizing, and it should shake the confidence of anyone who has any familiarity with the system as it currently stands. But on a much more important level, and I think it's relevant now because we're in the midst of a gubernatorial campaign, and there are a number of candidates for that office who are offering a range of policy prescriptions and a range of ideas for the ways they would improve the economy, how they would improve education, how they might protect the environment. From my perspective, this is the most fundamental, this is the most foundational, this is the thing that should distinguish any candidate for that office from anyone else. And any candidate, Republican or Democrat, I don't care what party they are in, if they do not have an answer to what they are prepared to do to hold this agency accountable and to change the culture inside this agency, they're not qualified to be the governor of this state. That's how serious this is. Because as the former district attorney, I was routinely asked what we could do about crime, how we could make a safer community. And we would end up in conversations about the criminal justice system, which I was, as many of you know, very much part of, whether it was revolving door in detention, adequate sentencing, upstream interventions. Here's what every police officer, sheriff's deputy, and prosecutor in this state knows, is that the failure of this system is the biggest contributing factor to our public safety crisis. The children who survive this gauntlet, who come out on the other side without getting the care and treatment that they need, without getting protection that they deserve and are entitled to, they are the ones that we end up arresting for violent crimes and sending to prison more often than not. I've spent most of my adult life inside prosecution offices, and we hear the stories repeatedly about what was the life of a criminal defendant before they picked up a gun and before they engaged in some violent crime. And in that moment, police officers and prosecutors, we do what we are expected and required under the law to do, which is to hold people accountable. But I cannot tell you how many times the origin story of that 21 or 22 or 23-year-old person started off when he was 4 or 5 and he was abused or neglected, and someone from CYFD knocked on the door and no one did anything. And if we're going to get serious about public safety in this state, we need to start making the connection between the lack of action and the lack of progress in CYFD and gun violence on our streets. There is a direct connection between those things. And we need to, as a part of our public safety dialogue and public safety debate, have a meaningful conversation about this. Because there is no amount of prosecution, detention, incarceration that you can do on the back end that will ever change the fundamental crime dynamics in this community if you continue to fail to protect vulnerable kids, abused and neglected kids. And it's that simple. And anyone who wants to lead needs to have an answer to these things. And the last thing I will say is that we are living in tremendously fraught political times with deep polarization, right? The minute anyone in any community raises their hand on any number of issues, lines are drawn and everyone retreats to their corner. But you know what the thing is about this? This isn't a Democrat issue. This isn't a Republican issue. This isn't one of those issues where if you talk to New Mexicans about what divides them, their commitment to fixing this transcends all of that. That means there's a meaningful opportunity for change. That means there's an opportunity to pull parties that scream past each other all the time, to pull them together around this issue, and fix this, because there's nothing more important. I will tell you for my own part, the information contained in this report, what we have learned over the past year was a revelation even for me. But it will be an abiding commitment for me personally and for this agency to do everything that we can to continue to provide for oversight, for accountability. But let there be no mistake, the era of CYFD stonewalling, of hiding behind confidentiality, of threatening and intimidating people and retaliating against people is over. This agency will not tolerate it, and we will do everything in our power to put an end to it. With that, I'm happy to stand for your questions.
We're gonna go to Esteban first.
Esteban with the Santa Fe New Mexican. Attorney General, you don't see state agencies suing other state agencies every day. Can you talk a little bit about the authority that you have to do this as the Attorney General, and also, criticism? Or can you respond to criticism that you might face for, conflict of interest or any other sort of concerns?
Yeah, fundamentally, my job is to represent the people of this state. And the statutory authority that I have confers a good deal of discretion to interpret the public interest and do everything in my power to protect the public. And what does that mean? There is a narrower version or a more limited understanding of the role of the Attorney General, who is only supposed to stand up and defend government agencies when they are called to account. That actually is something that is not historically supported. There are a number of cases, including in this state, where my predecessors filed actions against state agencies on a range of issues, and there are AGs around the country who do the same. My job is to uphold the rule of law, uphold the Constitution, and protect the people. And if you think about the lawsuit that we filed, most of the attorneys who operate in this space negotiate on behalf of an individual client, and they are trying to recover damages to make whole that client. And at a certain point, the trade that is on offer, which they have to respect in the best interests of their clients, is CYFD offers you money, and in exchange for that money, so that that surviving child can go on and live a better life, hopefully, we're not going to accept responsibility, and don't tell anybody about it. The problem with that system is that if it goes on like that over and over and over again, it doesn't do anything to protect the next family and the next family and the next. I have no doubt that the department will try to challenge my authority to take this action. My advice to the leaders of that agency and to the future leaders of that agency is, rather than trying to fight accountability, maybe that's time and energy that's better spent protecting kids. Next question.
Attorney General, the governor is the one who at the end of the day is in charge of this agency. She's appointed the secretaries, many of them over the last 8 years. Have two-part question here. Have you spoken to her about your findings, and whether or not you have, what do you expect from her moving forward? Is a special session one of your requests?
I haven't spoken with the governor directly about the findings. We'll be happy to share the findings with her office and obviously with CYFD directly. I think what is inescapable in the conclusions that are set forth in these 215 pages is a very clear-cut historical account of the failures that have occurred in the past. I'm more interested in the future, and I'm more interested in shaping the debate around how to fix these problems in the future. It's not my sense that that's something that's likely to occur in the next 8 months or so, but it is my expectation that it's something that's at the top of the agenda for the next administration.
We'll go to Danielle, Source New Mexico.
Hi, Attorney General. Thanks for having this. What can you say about the Office of the Child Advocate, which is housed under the NMDOJ? What's their position on these findings, and what are they doing next on this?
Yeah, we are happy to support the establishment of the Office of the Child Advocate. I think it's an important step forward. We will obviously be sharing this report with her as she staffs up, as she starts to engage in the process of identifying specific recommendations. As you can imagine, there are a number of the issues that we spot at the beginning, which I would imagine she would be very interested in looking into the 8 systemic failures that we identified in the report. And ultimately, she has the opportunity to examine those things, make policy recommendations, and even make referrals to this office for future action. I think it's probably early or a little premature, given that she's still staffing up and building capacity for that office to respond, but I expect she will be part of the conversation when policymakers in Santa Fe convene and really dig into it.
We got Ryan, KOB.
Attorney General, CYFD's house has been on fire for years. You said that you're interested in paths forward to improve it and identified some things that have already been identified in ways to improve the agency. Is there any indication there are improvements in any of those areas? Because in the co-neutrals mediation, CYFD likes to argue we're making steps forward here. And then every time we hear that there's steps forward, we hear, oh my gosh, we have so much more work to do. Are we improving in any meaningful ways right now?
I think it's a fair question. I think there are some issues that we've identified in the course of this report that have seen some modest improvement with some specific changes that have been made, but those are still very early in terms of evaluating their larger impact. Right, we spent a lot of time in this report talking about CARA and the problems with CARA and the issues that we have with a lack of meaningful interventions for drug-addicted children. There seems to be some improvement in that space. it's my understanding that reading some of the recent reports from the co-neutrals that there has been some stabilization or improvement on some of the recruiting issues. The problem that I think persists beyond that is there has been this piecemeal approach, right? There has been this, to your point, right? This is a house that's been on fire and something happens, a case unfolds, and we have an immediate response, right? From the governor's office or from the secretary's office, and there's some rushed response to that. What I am looking for is a legislatively led, comprehensive initiative to re-examine the structure of this entire agency, right? That one issue that I identified earlier about keeping investigations in proximity to people who are responsible for placements, like that is a profound structural question. And so I am of the view that the legislature should start with a blank piece of paper, right? Instead of trying to redesign a broken house, start with a blank sheet of paper and build what you think needs to exist from the ground up, and then see if you can map that onto the existing structure. I'm not sure that you can, to be perfectly honest with you, in part because it's not only a structural problem, it's a cultural problem. What ends up happening is the people who are the most concerned about the agency are the ones who are forced out or silenced. And those that remain learn very quickly that in order for them to maintain their position in the agency, they better fall in line. And fixing that cultural problem may prove to be even more problematic than the structural reorganization.
Jessica, KRQE.
Attorney General, at the center of all of this, our state has just been hell-bent in putting these kids back into these homes and going to that philosophy. How do we change that philosophy? And they're citing studies showing that this is best for those children.
Right. I think this is not dissimilar to the challenge that we faced when I was the district attorney, and we would routinely hear about the urgent need to return criminal defendants to the streets as quickly as possible because it was going to support, some academic view of public safety. But I'm not afforded the luxury of an academic view of public safety. I have to have a real view of public safety. And I think part of the cultural challenge inside this agency is that they are so dominated by those concerns and those voices that they have turned the dial too far. Now, it is not my intention, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand or misconstrue what we're trying to do here. I don't want to create such a reactionary system that we're yanking every child out of every home without evidence, without process or anything like that. But putting someone under a temporary plan because you don't have the space to put them into in a safe, permanent location is a temporary bureaucratic solution that leads to death and harm. And we need to change that fundamentally. And we haven't had a real debate. I mean, from my perspective, we track the legislation and the legislature fairly closely. And what ends up happening is we end up with specific, discrete solutions to specific, discrete problems. What we need is a comprehensive solution and approach to that larger issue.
And then I have one more question as well. Would you go after any of the workers lately? We've been seeing in some of these wrongful death lawsuits, the workers actually being named, including the latest with Jaden Garcia. And in there it shows that there was just neglect, that they didn't render aid. Could you go after any of these workers criminally?
I don't want to speculate on any criminal action that may or may not be taken by the agency, but I will tell you that we are going to remain vigilant. And look, these are difficult jobs in the best of times. When they're well-resourced, when they're well-supported, when they're highly trained, you are asked in that position to make a difficult decision. And so I don't want to scare someone who is doing their level best to try and protect kids. But if a bad decision is made and someone goes into a state system and tries to erase a record to cover misconduct, that's a different story altogether. And that's the kind of conduct that may result in a criminal action and a criminal investigation by this agency.
Attorney General, you mentioned there aren't enough places for these kids. That's long been CYFD's response, I know, to us when we ask why kids are in offices or congregate care. Their response today will likely be, well, we need more foster families and we need more help, or we need parents to be parents, right, and not
Yep.
cause these problems in the first place.
Yep.
What do you say to that?
Those things are all true, but the most important thing that they need is leadership. Real leadership, right? Real accountability at the highest levels. And I don't know that we've had that, frankly, in the last several years. Real experienced leadership who are willing to take those issues on. But think about some of the issues that we've identified in this report and in the lawsuit. If you are trying to recruit foster families into a broken system or a system that's having as many challenges as we're clearly having, is it going to help in that process to threaten to retaliate against foster families when they raise their hand? Does it help them when they get sued, when they get threatened with sanctions, when they get, told by the agency that they don't want to be heard, right? We don't want to hear your complaints or your concerns. That's the wrong message. What you want is to create a dynamic where you are fostering real engagement from these families and trying to get them involved in a way that prioritizes those types of placements. But what we've done is in a rush to hire people too quickly, one of the things we didn't even cover is the fact that very few of the investigators or frontline workers in this agency are social workers. We don't have trained social workers making a lot of these judgments. So, how are you going to convince foster parents to engage in a system where you can't even go and build a pipeline of social workers? And I would understand if this were a one-off or a one-year problem, but it's not. It's a multi-year problem. It's a problem that extends beyond a single governor and to, leaders in both parties. But here's the other thing. How many billions of dollars have we had in surplus money in the last decade? And I would imagine if you were going to ask the voters of New Mexico, hey, what should we do with all that surplus money in our budget? And you listed protecting abused and neglected kids along with all the other things that money is getting spent on in this state, I would be hard pressed for anyone to think that their priority is going to come out ahead of that. So what kind of financial supports and incentives do we have in place? It's on us to make those things work.
Take one more question. Colleen, Ed, do you have anything? Nope.
Colleen Hill, Journal. What kind of culpability do judges in children's court have in sending kids back to their families?
It's my sense that the cultural orientation that has placed family reunification ahead of child safety is not one that is confined to CYFD. I think there are a number of judges who have made that their touchstone. More importantly, there are a number of judges who have implicitly embraced this view of confidentiality as a sword to be wielded against people who raise their hand and speak out. I'm not at liberty to discuss in more detail the specific cases where that has occurred, but I know for a fact that there are judges in districts across this state who have threatened foster families and others with criminal sanctions and contempt citations for speaking out, and that needs to change. And that is something that I intend to raise with the Chief Justice at the earliest convenience. Thank you again for participating in this very important conversation. This is for us just the beginning, so I urge you to stay focused on these issues, and please do what you can to tell the stories of these kids, because they deserve it, and we all have to look ourselves in the mirror and try to ask what we can do to make this better. So thank you again. I appreciate it.